In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and was soon the head of a single-party state. That said, it took Hitler several years until 1938 to achieve total control of the state. As his authority increased, foreign policy grew more aggressive. This was also the result of an ever-strengthening economy that allowed not only for rearmament, but also economic power over much of Central and Eastern Europe at the expense of Great Britain and France. The Nazi Party moved swiftly to consolidate its power after taking control of the government in the midst of the Great Depression. First, there was a merger between the Nazi Party and the government through Gleichschaltung, a policy meaning make the same in German. These new policies resulted in all other political parties other than the Nazi Party being abolished. All labor unions were abolished. All governing councils and governors were replaced by Nazi Party appointed officials. And all police forces were merged with the paramilitary organization known commonly as the SS. While the German state and the Nazi Party merged, Hitler consolidated his own power by having all political party rivals executed in 1934. Until that point, there had been internal debate and dissension about the nature and direction of the party, and therefore the state. After this, there was no debate. The only institution beyond Hitler's total control was the German army, which was managed by the conservative nobility. Army officers saw Hitler, an Austrian who had only attained the low rank of corporal in the First World War, as a foreigner and a politician who could not be trusted. Hitler finally took control of the army in 1938 by replacing the top commanders. By 1938, there were no institutions that Hitler and the Nazi Party did not control within Germany. At each stage of the consolidation of power within Germany, Hitler's foreign policy increasingly challenged the post-war settlements of the First World War. With the new Nazi government, new policies to deal with the Great Depression were generated. From October 1933, Germany would, as far as possible, trade only with countries that would purchase German goods of equal value to what Germany imported from that country. If Romania, for example, wanted Germany to purchase its oil or wheat, then Romania had to purchase an equivalent amount of German industrial goods such as cameras and automobiles. In 1934, this new economic policy, now called the New Plan, was expanded on by the German Minister of Economics, Helmut Schult. This new program gave the German government much more control over the economy, dictating what could and could not be imported. By exchanging goods of equal value and purchasing only essential materials, plus exporting increasing amounts of manufactured goods to states that mainly produced raw materials, Germany's economy recovered more rapidly than any other European state during the Great Depression. The success of the new plan meant cheaper food prices in Germany, as food was now mainly imported from Central and Eastern Europe, and more money to purchase raw materials that could be then used for rearmament. Massively increased trade with Central and Eastern Europe states meant that their economies also benefited, and they became more dependent on Germany for their prosperity and economic stability. The effect of Germany's increasing economic and therefore political sway was compounded by British and French policies of imperial preference. The new plan was clearly successful in reducing unemployment and strengthening Germany's economy by 1936. Then Schult was pressured to allow the purchase and use of more raw materials such as iron and coal to produce armaments such as aircraft, tanks, guns, and ammunitions. As the purchase of these raw materials consumed critical important foreign currencies and gold for products that were not useful as exports, Schult resisted. He believed that this policy of major military spending would wreck Germany's economy. In September 1936, the government announced a 4-year plan for the country's economy and that it would be led by Hermann Göring. Schultz remained Minister of Economics, but was steadily eroding authority. He resigned as minister in November 1937. The 4-year plan aimed to increase agricultural production, achieve self-sufficiency in the production of raw materials, continue strict government regulation of imports and exports, and increase military production at the expense of consumer production. Historians such as Richard Overy state that it is clear that the 4-year plan was enacted to prepare Germany for some eventual war, probably at some point in the 1940s. The plan indicates that Germany's government believed it was vulnerable to blockades and embargoes of raw materials, hence the call to increase its own agricultural and raw material production. As part of this preparation, new emphasis was placed on creating substitutes for products such as rubber that Germany could never produce naturally. Synthetic oil and synthetic rubber factories were given a priority in terms of construction. What the 4-year plan meant was that Germany was able to rapidly increase its production of military equipment. It also meant that there were far fewer goods for consumers to purchase, although wages increased and unemployment continued to drop. This led to inflation as prices rose for increasingly similar quantity of consumer goods available. Several historians have indicated that political pressure from workers and the economy generally was one of the major factors pushing Germany to war in 1939. Germany, after surrendering during World War I, was disarmed as a first step towards general disarmament in Europe. But while Germany was disarmed, its neighbors were not. Poland, Germany's eastern neighbor, had up to 300,000 active soldiers and 700,000 in reserves. France had almost identical numbers on Germany's western border and was determined to prevent another German invasion. In 1921, France and Poland formed an alliance which called for each to support the other in case either was attacked. France also created the Little Entente in 1920 and 1921, which included the promise of help from Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. These two alliances had the ability to field millions of troops against Germany. German vulnerability was clearly demonstrated in 1923. Germany was required by a provision of the Treaty of Versailles to repay France and Belgium for damages for the First World War. In 1922, Germany announced that it was unable to continue payments. France and Belgium invaded Germany in January 1923, occupying the Ruhr region, which was a major industrial center. Although the occupation, which led to diplomatic, political, and economic crisis for all involved, ended by 1925, the event clearly indicated Germany's vulnerability to invasion. France and his allies argued that Germany had a larger population than any other state in Europe except the Soviet Union, and with its industry, it could rapidly rearm. Maintaining large military forces was required for long-term security of France and its allies. Many in Germany were also concerned about communism and the growing strength of the Soviet Union, which helped propel the Nazi Party into power. The Soviet Union was the largest state in the world, and by 1932 it completed its first 5-year plan, which helped it industrialize on a massive scale. With the launching of the second 5-year plan, many in Germany felt a need to prepare for the country's defense in case of invasion. Only Poland lay between the Soviet Union and Germany. After many years of research and reports, the League of Nations World Disarmament Conference met in Geneva, Switzerland in 1932. There were immediately calls for participating nations, including France, Britain, and Germany, to reduce the size of their armies and amount of military equipment. France simply refused to cooperate with disarmament talks unless Britain and the USA agreed to guarantee its security through an alliance. Both countries refused. As talks continued into 1933, Germany declared that if France would not limit its military, then it would be forced to arm itself for defense. Germany withdrew from the conference when it became clear that France would not disarm, and withdrew from the League of Nations shortly afterwards. It was clear to many in Germany that rearmament was necessary for national security. Although Germany had already produced some weaponry beyond what was allowed in the Treaty of Versailles, it announced massive rearmament in March of 1935. Rearmament included the introduction of conscription, construction of 2,500 aircraft of various types, expansion of the Navy, mass productions of guns of all types, tanks, and artillery. By 1936, Germany had the ability to produce 5,000 aircraft annually, and by 1939, it had an army of 700,000, with 3 million more in reserves. The rapidity of Germany's rearmament essentially validated France's belief that Germany had the ability to become a major military power quickly. While many historians now question the quality and equipment of Germany's new army, rearmament was accomplished during the Great Depression when most countries worked to do the opposite, that is, control spending and reduce imports. German rearmament appeared as some miracle to most observers, not least because much of it was achieved using imported materials and because it led to practically zero unemployment. Almost immediately, the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy met in Stresa, Italy in April 1935 to respond to Germany's clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. All countries condemned Germany's plan to rebuild its military and promised to work together. This initiative is often called the Stresa Front, and it amounted to little. Each of these countries had differing goals and little ability to act. Hitler immediately assured these states of Germany's peaceful intentions. Germany proposed non-aggression pacts with its neighbors, similar to that agreed with in Poland in 1934. Hitler also promised to observe the Locarno treaties, in which Germany recognized the borders of neighboring Western states as permanent. Finally, he also stated that Germany would accept limitations on armaments if other countries limited their war capabilities as well. Since Poland's non-aggression agreement with Germany in 1934, France no longer saw Poland as a reliable ally. France sought a stronger ally since Britain refused any form of an alliance. France turned to the Soviet Union. In May 1935, France and the Soviet Union established the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance. This treaty stated that both would work through the League of Nations to ensure peace in Europe, and each would come to the assistance of the other in case of attack by a third country. Many conservatives in France feared communism more than Nazi Germany, and through political pressure managed to ensure that no military discussions or plans were made between the Soviet Union and France, rendering the agreement powerless. France was already the strongest military power in Europe and perhaps the world in the early 1930s. Throughout the 1930s, it increased military spending substantially. Initially, it built a massive series of fortifications, tank barriers, trenches, barbed wire, and walls known as the Maginot Line, which stretched primarily along the border between Germany and France. The British government had followed a strict policy of limited military spending since the end of the First World War. There was little political support for rearmament, as that would increase taxation, and with the onset of the Great Depression, there was even less interest in building large military forces. German rearmament, however, alarmed many throughout the country, and the government responded. The government realized that it would only be able to negotiate from a position of military strength. It was also understood that it would take many years before that strength was at a point where Britain could defend itself and strike Germany if required. Rearmament began on a large scale in Great Britain. This consisted not only of mass production of aircraft, artillery, and warships, but also expanding industrial capacity. The government focused on building the infrastructure necessary for large-scale war production, such as increased railway lines, shipbuilding facilities, factories, power plants, and more. Spending on rearmament increased over 600% between 1935 and 1939. It was projected that Britain would be at its strongest in relation to Germany by the autumn of 1939. Germany's domestic economic decisions to implement the four-year plan and rearm itself on a grand scale in the early 1930s had a major impact on the Western great powers, causing some of them to rearm as well. It also affected Germany's foreign policy, and that this became increasingly aggressive as its economic power grew.